Created in 2005 and hosted by security industry veterans, Paul Security Weekly is your source for in-depth coverage of the latest vulnerabilities, exploits, and security research. Our weekly security news discussion dives deep into the security issues we face today and potential solutions in a fun and lively atmosphere. Each week, we bring on guests from the security community to learn about their journey and discuss topics relevant to their work and research. You can also subscribe to our show by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe or look for Paul Security Weekly in your favorite podcast catcher. We've recorded a ton of content over the years, so we created Spotify playlists featuring some of our favorite episodes, including interviews with Marcus Random, John McAfee, and Chris Roberts, to name a few. You can find them at securityweekly.com/starter packs.
Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Jason Albuquerque and Ben Carr. Follow us on LinkedIn for updates across our organization, show highlights, and more. You can find us by searching for Security Weekly Productions. All right, gentlemen, it's been a few weeks since we've done articles because we haven't been live in a few weeks. And there's been a lot of stuff happening over the past couple weeks. So I tried to pull them all together in this really wonderful, CISO Scapegoat as the SEC Welcomes CISOs to the big leagues. A whole string of fun articles here.
Yeah, it's a good set of articles we have to cover here, and I'm sure there's going to be some emotion behind some of these.
Yeah, I mean, look, I start with the first one, right? We've been talking about this whole thing from a CISO perspective and the scapegoats. I mean, we've got Sullivan, we've got Brown, now we've got another CISO getting let go as part of a breach. But it's even worse than that because now they reward the CEO, the board, all the board members. It's like, whoa, where is corporate governance here?
It's absolutely unbelievable. I mean, you're talking about a $500 million loss in revenue, a cut of their valuation of $3 billion, and the CEO now becomes CEO and board chair. The board chair becomes an independent director still on the board. And the other 10 directors just skate on right through and get reappointed with no opposition. And in the meantime, the CISO is gone. And I can only think that they were booted, even though there may have been some type of resignation letter or something like that. But the information about how that happened is not even clear.
Yeah, it's not clear. A lot of the reporting some of the reporting that I've seen on that would tend to indicate that the CISO left, right? And what that means as far as, like you said, did they file a resignation letter, or was there enough going on where they felt in the wake of, the stuff that's gone on with Uber and SolarWinds, did they feel a need to exit after that incident because they weren't being listened to? I mean, there's a lot up in the air to see how that shakes out, what happens. I think at the end of the day, it's with the new guys, it's clear, people just aren't addressing this in the manner it needs to be. I mean, if there's malfeasance on the part of the CISO, that's certainly one thing. But if, they're not being listened to, if investment's not being made, then there needs to be other ramifications within the management of the company. And the CISO may not need to be the person that exits or is asked to leave, right?
And either way, would you want to be part of an organization where you literally have all of the burden of this data breach, and you're sitting around looking around and seeing all of these other folks at the highest level getting richer, getting more power, and you're still
taking all the risk.
Have to have that burden of what happened? I wouldn't.
Well, maybe that's the job definition of a chief risk officer: is you assume all the risk and it's all on your shoulders, right? I'm not sure how else to take this in the way of what we see going on.
Right. And my fear is that this is, and it most likely is, this is the avenue that most organizations are going to take. This is the strategy that they're going to have in front of them. If anything were to happen, if they have a breach, they're going to blame threat actors. They're going to put the burden on the CISO or the risk officer, and they're just going to continue on their ways.
Yeah. And I don't think this is what the SEC intended with the new regulations, right? I can't see this being a positive outcome of some of the early breaches that went through some of the early test reporting to the new SEC requirements. Like, I'm not sure that this was the intended outcome of a situation like this. So I think this sets a pretty bad or ugly precedent for some of this new stuff coming down. And we got to get our arms around this.
Can we chalk this up to poorly written metrics and requirements, right? This is what happens when you don't create the right incentives for people to do what you're actually expecting them to do, right? I mean, if you look at just the reporting requirements, and there wasn't an article in this week, but it kind of aligns with the same thing. We saw a threat actor actually file an issue with the SEC saying that someone they had compromised didn't report in the timeline necessary, right? Like, now you've got to worry about for your threat actors attacking you on regulatory issues as well. Like, it's going down a rabbit hole.
Yeah. I don't think this was the intended outcomes that the SEC wanted. So we'll see how this plays out. But I could not pass this article up. And there's a couple others in here, by the way, that kind of go down this very similar kind of discussion. So article number 2 talks about overboarding. Now, what's overboarding? That means when one of your members sits on so many boards, right? And I tie this back to the first article a little bit, thinking like, okay, they got 10 board members that skated by. How many other boards do those 10 people sit on? Like, are they just gaslighting this everywhere they sit? Like, so I brought this article in to bring up this concept of overboarding. And what does that mean? I think what I'm worried about here is that we've got a good old boys, girl, and club here in all these board seats. They sit on multiple boards, and they just keep gaslighting everything that they've been doing. And we're never going to get the change that the SEC is intending with these new cybersecurity reporting requirements. And so, do we need to go back and look at the make up the board again?
Absolutely. And right now, there is no oversight as to how many you can sit on. I mean, there's some best practices that are out there that say, best practice would be voting against someone who sits on more than 5 boards, right? And then they say if you're a CEO of a public company, then you should only sit on 2. But at the end of the day, there's nothing that limits it. And we all know, if we're trying to do too many things, we're not going to do any of them well. We talk about that in cybersecurity initiatives and projects, in goals, and in things that we're trying to achieve within our organization. If we try to juggle too many, we're never going to do any of them well. Well, that lends to this as well. If you sit on too many boards, you're not going to perform well. You're not going to be bringing your A game.
Agreed. And look, I thought the SEC had an opportunity to take some of this guidance a little further than they did. You're seeing the ramifications of some of that with the first article. You tie that into overboarding potential issues. Anyways, I think we want some guidance. I think we will have to have some guidance at some point, not only on the makeup of the board, but also maybe how many boards you can sit on, so that you can put the focus on individual companies and really get your arms around the risk aspects, instead of just, to me, it's just like, okay, I sit on all these boards, I'm getting paid, but I'm just gaslighting everything. And I don't think that's the intent of the board.
And you want to know what? In reading that second article about overboarding, I read a lot about the board having all of these different pressures on them and things that they need to keep up with. And one of them was ESG, environmental, social governance. Nowhere in this article did they mention cybersecurity or compliance risk at all. I actually did a search on the article, and the only places cybersecurity or compliance came up were in the ads that were on the website. So ultimately, cyber wasn't even part of this. Cybersecurity wasn't part of this article at all.
And if you were an investor in a publicly traded company, right, and you were looking at like, what are the biggest risks? What would I be concerned about affecting the overall stock price, the share price, right, as an investor? Would it be ESG or would it be security? Like, which would be the one that would potentially have the most impact? I mean, I think it's clear it's security.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what blew my mind, that ESG got called out versus cybersecurity risk.
Yeah. Article number 3, the second Forbes article. These articles were a couple of these really like were front and center right in Forbes this last couple of weeks. So the SEC welcomes CISOs to the big leagues. Now, I take issue with what this means. So the author of this article says, I believe this move indicates something deeper. Specifically, overnight, the SEC has essentially elevated the CISO role within the C-suite. I don't think so.
Well,
I
they
think this is
elevated the
putting
burden and
CISOs
the
on.
risk, but they didn't elevate anything else. They didn't elevate
Right,
the power, the ability to influence. They just elevated the risk to the person.
Yeah, well,
Yes.
look, I mean, there's another sense. I expect more CISOs to ask to be included in corporate directors' D&O insurance. Like, you shouldn't have to ask. Right? Like, I mean, there should just be things that are like, this is a C-level role. You're holding a certain level of responsibility for a certain risk within the organization. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be a, asking to get a seat at the table, asking to get D&O insurance, asking to be involved, asking, like, that's the wrong perspective here, right? I mean, it's just to the point we've been talking about. You've got to have clear commitments and requirements for what you're expecting these roles to do, as opposed to letting people interpret them, because they're going to interpret them how they want to, and to their best benefit.
Yeah. And again, I mean, if you're reading and having conversations with other CISOs, and the article calls it out, there are really two camps here, right? There are the camps that are like, this is a threat. It could harm me personally. We're not doing the right things, and this is all reacting defensively. And then the other camp is saying that this is a blessing. This is going to change things. This is going to, shine a light on things to elevate the CISO to a higher spot. Unfortunately, actions so far are not showing that. Look at Clorox, article number 1, right? So actions are not showing that.
The number of companies that still don't have CISOs, right? And if you talk to recruiters right now, there isn't a mass hiring event going on for well-positioned and experienced CISOs. It's kind of a tepid market right now. People are trying to still figure out with the economy how things are going to go. And so I think that's a lead indicator that people just aren't taking this seriously still.
Right.
Right.
There was a line in the article that says, although it may have taken us by surprise, the CISO is now even more important part of the C-suite. Congratulations. I'm not seeing a reason to congratulate anyone yet.
No. The premise of the article is that the SEC has elevated the CISO to the C-suite. I'm not sure that's how organizations currently see it. And I think that's the big disconnect.
That's it.
Yeah. I think most organizations looked at it and said, they don't really have to do much.
Right. Yeah. We just put somebody else has got to put their name on this thing, and then if we don't like it, we'll just scapegoat them. Yeah.
That's right.
Why not? Yeah. So it's a premise of the article that I was a little concerned with. I think the title was interesting because it is potentially a wake-up call to welcoming the CISOs into the big leagues. But if organizations are not going to put the protections in place and treat them like other C-level executives, then, it's going to be an ugly time. It's going to be an ugly time.
We're already seeing that unfold.
Yeah, exactly right. Next article, love this one. SolarWinds basically says, look, SEC, you're way over your head here.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm super interested to see where you guys come out on this, because I've got some definite thoughts with regard to this positioning by SolarWinds. So, Jason, where do you lie on this?
Well, I mean, I can only speak to what's been made available to us, right? I mean, I'm sure we don't have the entirety of the story. At the end of the day, I'm sure it's SolarWinds is posturing. There's no doubt about it. What else would they do? I mean, they're going to come out and say you have it all wrong at the end of it, right? But there's some information here that makes me think there could have been some information that was not included. So I don't know. I think there's a middle ground. I don't think there's a camp on either side here. I think we need to figure out what's going on. I think we need more information. I think it's still early for me to make a decision either way.
So my concern with this article is, go ahead, Matt.
Before you put your kind of stake in the ground, let me give you my quick take on this one, right?
Yeah.
Remember, we interviewed Tim Brown on this show in January. I thought he was very open and honest about what happened, the changes they made, and how to move forward. I thought they did a really good job in how they handled the breach the communications, the transparency, and the learning moments from this, right? So if you think about it from a reputational standpoint, I think SolarWinds did a lot of the right things. Now, whether this lawsuit is valid or not comes down to what did people know before and after the attack, and was people hiding stuff? And look, there's probably data to discover. But from the outside, looking at this case, I don't see anything wrong that SolarWinds necessarily did. I think they actually did things. And this is all before the SEC guidance and all the stuff that came out, right? So I thought they did a pretty good job. And so maybe there is a little bit of posturing here by SolarWinds, but they also kind of backed it up in what they've done over the past year plus around this breach.
Yeah, so I want to take this to the where SolarWinds is attacking the SEC and saying that they lack competency to regulate cybersecurity. And I would agree at a very high level that the SEC shouldn't regulate cybersecurity controls, right? But the SEC is responsible for regulating risk to the organizations that investors have to deal with. And so I think everything I've seen on this says there's two sides to the story, right? And there's nuance in it. And I'm sure that there's things that SolarWinds is saying that are true and things that are positive in the light that they're spinning them. And it's the same thing the SEC is doing. But at the end of the day, like, the SEC has to get involved where there's risk that investors are undertaking. And companies either are doing the right thing or not doing the right thing. And so some of the things they're alleging, I think, are certainly within the scope of what the SEC has to have a mandate over. There are other things that other organizations need to do to regulate some aspects of cybersecurity. But just throwing it out and saying, the SEC doesn't have the necessary foundation to regulate cybersecurity, I think that's a miss for me. Like that's where I really take concern with the positioning here and trying to get out. It's almost like, hey, we want to push back on any additional regulation or oversight. And I think that's exactly the wrong thing. Not a fan of oversight, not a fan of regulation, but if companies aren't going to do the right thing, and we're seeing that across the board, then I think we need somebody to step in.
And we've been talking about this for a long time on this show, that the only thing that was going to move the needle for cybersecurity was a level of oversight that didn't exist, right? So I think this is part of those growing pains to get there. It's unfortunate with the situations that have happened. And again, my stance is it's yet to be uncovered whether or not there was any level of misleading information or negligence or trying to hide the reality of what was going on. We don't know the detail yet, so we can't speak to that. But I think you're right, Ben. We do need a level of oversight, and it needs to start somewhere.
And Ben,
and will you agree if it's with regard to investors, it is the SEC that's the regulatory body over that, right? Like it just is.
Yeah, but you phrase it in a way that I think we've tried to really drill into our listeners over the past few years. You said risks, cybersecurity risks to the business, right? We've been talking about risk management and how we have to align cybersecurity to business risk. And so I agree with you. If organizations treated cybersecurity as a risk as part of a holistic risk management program, I think that's where the challenge still is. Because if you just treat cybersecurity as a compliance regulation, I think that's where we fall into the trap. And that's the nuance that I think we have to think about in what's going to happen. Because as a risk management professional, right, the decision is to accept the risk, mitigate the risk, or transfer the risk, right? It's okay to mitigate a risk if you document why and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Agreed.
And so it's okay to not have certain controls in place because you've decided you're going to accept that risk as is. You're not going to mitigate it. And if that's what happened here, then the SEC doesn't necessarily have a case from a risk management perspective because they decided to accept that level of risk. But if they're looking at it from a control regulatory requirement perspective, that's where things get a little wonky for me.
Yeah, but Matt, on that same line of thought, if SolarWinds said, "Hey, we're not going to do anything, right? We're not going to do anything with regard to cyber risk," and then they publish that information and they make it known to everyone that that's what they're doing, then I would agree that the SEC doesn't have a case. There's nothing there, right? Because they've let all their investors know. The problem is, and I've seen this over and over again, not just in sometimes with companies I've worked for, sometimes with colleagues that I've talked to, or we've all heard these stories of not a half truth being told, right? Or not exposing the details that, if you were an investor of a public company, you would have concern if you found that out, right? And so that's where I think the challenge comes in, is that the way I think SolarWinds is spinning this is saying, I think to your point, they lack competence to regulate cybersecurity. I'm not sure that that's what the SEC is trying to do. It may be. Again, the devil is in the details, and we only have the public information to look at. But I think that what the SEC is trying to get a handle on is, these issues with Clorox, where they lose that much value and the board gets elevated and the president, if everybody makes more money and the investors went down, that's exactly what they're supposed to be getting involved in.
Right.
Yeah.
No,
I will say that, the law of unintended consequence may happen here, because I think by going back and looking at some of the communications that were going on, especially about their SDLC process, identifying risk, and going back to those communications and leveraging it against the organization, that's going to stop cyber people from raising their hand. That's going to stop security personnel from actually going out there and saying, hey, I see a risk, and communicating that. I'm afraid of the law of unintended consequences here. We want folks identifying risk. We want our teams raising their hand when they see something that's not right.
Yeah, you want the documentation, right? You want to be able to go in and look and see what's going on. Again, I think you mentioned it earlier. It's all the details that need to come out, right? So if their supposition is there was a lot of stuff documented, nobody did anything, then that's wrong, right? If a lot of stuff was documented and the decision was made to accept risk as a company, it may not be great, but that's okay as long as you're communicating that this is our stance and these are the risks that we have.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, just to simplify it from my perspective, we kind of talked about what style or camp we're in. I'm in the camp of the truth. So let's let the truth come out in the investigation and figure it out from there. That's the camp that I'm in.
Yeah, agreed. So that leads us into article number 5, which is, if you are a CISO and you want to understand your obligations under the new SEC requirements, this is a really good source. So I think Baker Hofstetler, the law firm, put this together. And I put it in here more as a reference because I think it provides some really good guidance to what are the obligations and what action should be taken in the event of one of these breaches. Because we've seen now, right, it's just so recent with the Clorox stuff we just talked about in Article 1, the indictment of SolarWinds, which is like Articles 2 and 3, to if you're a CISO at a publicly traded company, what's your responsibility? This is a really good resource to go look at.
Yeah, no, this was a great find, Matt. I mean, honestly, it's like the cliff notes to what the requirements are. So it's great. I haven't read the whole article, but I'm very interested in digging in and getting a little bit more knowledgeable. But it's like the cliff notes. It's great.
Yeah. And I thought, just to help people, we talk about this. Again, it's a say easy, do hard, right? We're sitting here talking about this and the ramifications and the consequences and unintended consequences. But when you're in the chair and you actually have to do something about what is it that you have to do, this is a really good starting point. This is a really good reference doc. It's a good article.
It is. And I think people need to read through this and understand what they're going to do ahead of time, right? I'm a big fan of working through kind of, a tabletop, sand tables, figuring out what you're going to do ahead of the incident and do it frequently, right? You should be doing this at least twice a year to figure this out and identifying the gaps that you have in the unknowns. And so if you don't know, what's materiality? Is the incident material? If you're going to spend 2 days out of a 4-day notification window trying to figure out if it's material, you've already lost the fight. You've got to have these things locked down so you understand how to respond, how to react, and how to meet these requirements.
Yeah, we just did a tabletop exercise. I've done 2 of them with the previous 2 companies, right? And it's always interesting when you're in the throes of it and you're doing the tabletop exercise to realize, wait a minute, that's not really well defined. So is this an incident?
Yeah.
Isn't it an incident? Is it material? Is it not material? You can always come up with those situations where you have to go back and look and update kind of your guidance and your procedures around this.
Mm-hmm. And this is one of those areas where I've heard this mentioned a couple times, and I kind of feel like it may be the case that CISOs may need to have independent counsel, right? Because there may be incidents that happen in your you're talking with internal counsel and you're clearly believe that it's material, and internal counsel says it's not. Like, and so where do you come out on that, right? How do you back that? So I think the amount of knowledge that a CISO is going to have with regard to SEC regulations and legality has gone up substantially in the last 12 to 18 months.
Yeah. You you almost want to be a lawyer to be in the CISO role.
Yeah.
All right. So if
Speaking
you're tired
of
of the CISO role,
Yeah, right.
Right, exactly. If you're tired of being a CISO, you're tired of being the scapegoat, like what's your next career path? This next article, Article 6, talks about kind of like what's the future look like for the CISO role, what other positions you go into. We've covered this in the past, but it's just I pulled this article before the Clorox Scapegoat article. I pulled this a couple of weeks ago and I'm like, oh, this is a perfect time to pull it in.
Yeah, no, in all honesty, I mean, it's one of those scenarios where a strategic CISO really can focus on where they want to go within the organization, because if you're in that strategic position, you're doing the things that we talk about on this show, like integrating into the business, learning the business units, building relationships across all of the leadership team. You really are getting insight into how the business operates. So I mean, from my side, I've gone from CISO to a CIO to a chief operating officer because I've dug in and I learned the business. I think in all honesty, CISOs have kind of that ticket where they can go to chief technology officer, go to a CIO role, go to a chief operating officer role, start your own company as a CEO. I think honestly that it's unlimited where a CISO could go if you've truly embedded yourself in the organization and learned the business.
Yeah. And if you understand not only the business, but the risks associated with the business from a cybersecurity perspective, it gives you a perspective that most others vying for those positions may not have. And I think that also gives CISOs an advantage in some of these other roles because they understand the downstream impacts and risks associated with cybersecurity.
Right. And chief risk officer I don't think was in this list. So that's yet another C-level role that you could go after.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, I was surprised that the CRO was in here. I do think that I've seen a lot of not a lot. I've seen some organizations that are more forward thinking, questioning some of the roles that they have and saying, look, from a CIO perspective, as we've transitioned to a more cloud native, and a lot of stuff is either going to the CPO or the CTO, can the CISO really elevate and run the IT org as well, right? And I think that's a very successful area that you will see more companies go to. I think CTO might be a challenge, and chief security, obviously, that's an obvious one. I think that's a really low bar of entry to transition to that. I mean, usually it entails picking up physical security is the big thing that most CISOs don't necessarily have ownership of or experience with.
Right. Final article for this week. Biden administration basically says, give me a data privacy law, folks, if you want to deal with AI. I thought this was a really interesting position here. We've talked about this on the show multiple times about the need for a national data privacy law so we don't have 50 independent state-driven privacy laws. It looks like the administration's kind of behind that saying, look, if you want to regulate AI, that's fine, but we got to do it under a holistic data privacy law, not as a separate AI law. So I thought that was a really interesting stance because, as you guys know, we have not made any progress with national privacy.
No, I read this article and I said, please let this be the catalyst to a national, data protection law that will uproot the 50, right? That's the key. I don't know if I want to be dealing with a national and 50 on top of it.
Yeah, 51. That doesn't help out.
No, not at all.
Definitely.
When I read this, I thought this is generally like it's two separate things, though, right? Like, so if you just think about the AI problem and say, oh, that's all data privacy, that is concerning to me as well. Like, I think that there is a privacy issue, which it does involve AI, but transcends AI, right? We need one law across the country. But there are other issues with AI that go beyond just privacy, right? Like that's a bigger nut that I don't think we've really even thought about cracking and where we've gone with privacy, it's going to be years before we get there. But yeah, I mean, I just definitely think there's two separate questions there with regard to privacy and
no, that's a great point, because Ben, I just assumed that what they meant in this article was that, dependency for this is a data privacy law national, right? If we want to move forward with AI, we need to have a data privacy law that is national. Now, I hope that it's not just going to be focused on AI. I hope it's going to be something that's a lot more comprehensive. So great point. I just made the assumption that it was more of that dependency type conversation.
Yeah, and because we reviewed a few weeks back some of the regs around AI, and most of them seem to be kind of more around privacy data leakage initially. There's a lot of aspects of AI, Ben, to your point, that wouldn't get covered in a national data privacy law. But I think the premise here is you have a national data privacy law that includes aspects of AI from a privacy perspective. Then you can also go tackle other components of AI regulations that you want to put in place. It's kind of how I read it. So yes, I hope it's not just a data privacy law just for AI. It should be more holistic. It should replace the 50 independent states and become the law of the land, so that we have one privacy policy to administer to versus 51.
Can I get a hallelujah?
Hallelujah, brother. Gentlemen, it's always a pleasure to have you join me. Thank you everyone for watching and listening. We'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.